about cause and effect, about causation, that every effect has many causes. What do I mean by that? Well, take an event like the First World War. That's a big event. There was a certain beginning of the First World War in 1914, and one of the causes of that was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo, by Gavrilo Princip, who was a Serbian nationalist. And the Archduke was assassinated, and that was one of the causes of the First World War. No one should say that that was the only cause of the First World War. And this is what historians debate about, what all the different causes of the First World War are. So when we talk about the cause of an event like the First World War, we don't really mean the cause any more than when we say, let's go to the pub, we mean that there's only one pub. We don't mean that, we're just talking about one of the many. And so when we talk about the cause of the First World War, we mean it's one of the causes of the First World War. Take a more simple example. Supposing there's a fire in a house, and the fire is brought about by a short circuit, electrical fault. So we could say the short circuit caused the fire. When we say that, we don't mean that it's the short circuit on its own, in the absence of everything else, that caused the fire. We mean the short circuit along with other factors, like, for example, the presence of oxygen, the presence of inflammable material, the absence of a sprinkler system. All these things are things that contribute to the fire's occurrence. And there's no requirement, when we have many causes like this, to think that all those causes are ultimately one. The world is a tangled sort of jungle of causes. And the job of the scientist or the empirical investigator is to just try and unweave some of these branches and see what makes what happen. So my view is that's the way it is with the mind and the body. Our decisions are exercises of our capacity of the will. That capacity, obviously, is realized in our brain. I say obviously, I mean, this is something that we know. We don't know where it's realized, and there's no part of the brain where we can say, this is decision-making, because that's not what psychological capacities are like. So nonetheless, so in any case of making a decision, there's a combination of these mental factors and the physical factors in your brain, and the other surrounding conditions that make that possible. Now, all the second premise of the causal argument says is that whenever you find a physical effect, you're going to find a physical cause. Rather, I say, that's what it should say. If it says anything more than that, then it shouldn't. And that's why I think this argument doesn't work in establishing the truth of physicalism, because there can be mental causes and physical causes of physical effects. And we're not required to identify one with the other. So that's the third point I want to make against the argument for physicalism. So I've made my 3 points. I've said what physicalism is, and I said why I don't believe it, and I said why we shouldn't accept the argument against it. So, thus, Professor Papineau is defeated.
Thank you very much, Professor Crane, for that really illuminating talk. Are there any questions?
In convincing yourself of saying that physical states, psychological states is as fundamental substance as much as biological or physiological states, and giving a zombie argument as an example of that, do you commit yourself to saying that psychological states can exist without physical states? And as such, that would be like saying the UN can exist if there weren't any countries.
Yes, that's a good question. I didn't make that clear enough. Descartes thought that the psychological states could exist without physical states. Now, the zombie argument actually goes the other way around. It says you've got the physical states existing without the psychological states. So that would be analogous to having all the countries of the UN together, but not having made the agreement to form the UN. So I'm not committing myself to that. When I said the mental properties are as real, I don't mean that they could exist. I don't mean by that they could exist independently of this material body. I just mean this material body doesn't determine them. They're in that sense. Now, actually, if you ask most physicalists the question, could there be a psychological being who existed independently of any physical state? So could there be a Descartesian soul or a ghost? Most physicalists would say, sure, there could be such a thing. That's just a remote possibility. But there wouldn't be such a thing in our universe. Our universe isn't. So, although it's not entailed by anything I say today, I would also say that second thing there.
Ben?
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. So you gave this argument, and you said you agreed that mental properties are causally efficacious and they can affect the physical world. My question is, if mental properties are something which are distinct from the physical properties that you also talked about, how is it that they can causally interact with physical things?
Yeah, the question was, if mental properties are something distinct from the physical and biological properties, how do they interact with those physical properties? Well, I think what I want to say first about that is that there's this famous remark of St. Augustine's, when he said, when asked, what is time? I know the answer to this question when I don't think about it. Or as soon as I think about it, I don't know the answer to the question. I would say we all actually find no difficulty in the idea that mental properties and mental actions affect things in the physical world. I recently went to Iceland, and in Iceland there was, in the harbour in Iceland, there was a spectacular new glass building, which was a bank. It was completely empty. It wasn't finished. None of it was finished. Why was it finished? Well, because of the financial crisis. What's the financial crisis? Financial crisis in some way has got something to do with the following fact, that in America, people sold houses to people who couldn't afford to pay the mortgages. Now that's a kind of psychological fact, right? Some guy comes to your house, he talks to you, he makes you sign a piece of paper. The psychological is all wrapped up in that kind of piece of activity. Somehow, those kind of psychological events had an effect on whether that building was finished in Iceland. And that seems to me a piece of very complex psychophysical causation, of a kind when I say we don't understand it, I mean we don't understand what the actual chain of events was. But we don't find any difficulty thinking that those things in America had these long-term effects on these things here. Well, you might say, but it's still not intelligible. Well, that may be because you have some particular idea in mind of what causation is, or that you think causation must be intelligible in a certain way. I want to say, in some sense, causation isn't intelligible to us. I mean, what makes one thing cause another is, in a way, it's just a matter of fact. Right? It just happens. If we try and find inner mechanisms that explain why one thing causes another, what we're finding is just more causes. So I think causation doesn't have a sort of inner nature in that way. You look completely unconvinced, but I was convinced by what I said.